So in this lecture, we are going to be looking at what was the cause of the American Revolution. Now, we all know the American Revolution was caused by taxes, don't we? Was it though? So in order to understand what is the cause of the American Revolution, we have to look at that 100 years that preceded it first. It's called the old colonial system. For more than 100 years, the colonists in America were part of the British Empire, were happy being part of the British Empire. They called themselves Englishmen, and they wanted to stay a part of the British Empire. And then beginning in 1763, from 1763 to 1775, just 12 years, that good working relationship where America was part of the British Empire will come crashing down, leading to the American Revolution. So we'll look at the causes of the American Revolution, and also in order to answer another question, who is really responsible for the American Revolution? Who caused it? Was it the British or was it the colonists? Now, we are just really briefly going over a very big period of time. And so there's a couple things you need to know about the old colonial system. Make sure you read the notes. The things that you really need to know about it is this large period of time where all the colonies were created. Georgia is the very last in 1730s, but the first two colonies were Virginia and Massachusetts, and then from there we start getting a New England, so all the colonies, Rhode Island and up, and then we had the southern colonies, Maryland and down, and during this period we added the ones in between, so all the colonies are connected. More importantly, during this period, England started to try to make money in the colonies by passing a series of acts called the Navigation Acts. And these are really important to know. You don't have to memorize what specifically it said. What you have to know about this, though, is the Navigation Acts are a series of acts with the basic purpose of encouraging the colonists not to trade with foreign countries. England only wants the colonists to trade with England. So all these acts were meant to discourage the colonists from trading with other countries and to only buy goods from England. So not sell to other countries and only buy from England. What you also have to know is that it is the first time the British put custom duties on products going into the colonies. Custom duties are, it's the same thing as a tariff. And you do not have to memorize this. It is just important to know the difference. People use tariffs and taxes interchangeably. And a tariff is a kind of tax, but they're not the same things. And the reason I'm explaining this will become clear later on when we're talking about the causes of the American Revolution. So a tariff, a tax is something the government passes for one specific purpose, to raise revenue. The reason custom duties and tariffs, we're using those interchangeably. The reason custom duties are different, because custom duties can be used for revenue, but custom duties are also used to regulate trade. And so custom duties can come in all different levels, and we won't get into that. But basically, custom duties it's a tax that on products going into the colonies, and in this case, also ones going out from the colonies. Usually it's just goods imported. So again, you don't have to know the specifics of it. If you're a colonist in Massachusetts and you're wanting to sell to France, your goods would have to go to England first. It's supposed to go to England first, where they would charge you before you send it to the foreign country. That way it's going to cost the colonists more money to encourage them to trade with England. Similarly, if the colonists want to buy something from France, a custom duty will be put on it before, or a tariff will be put on it before it comes to America, making that product more expensive. So a French shoe costs $2, $1 tariff is put on it before it comes to America. Now it's going to cost $3. well, if a British shoe is only $2, the colonists are going to buy the British shoe since it's $1 cheaper. So custom duties are meant to regulate trade, but they can also be used for revenue purposes. And so that is the difference between a tax and a tariff, or a tax and a customs duty. So we're not going to be using, we won't be using them interchangeably, and it'll become clear why in just a minute. So the British, with the Navigation Acts, put on custom duties and tariffs to try to discourage the colonists from trading with foreign countries and to only buy from England. There's been historians that said the Navigation Acts started the American Revolution. Well, these are passed in 1660. Between 1660 and 1663, the American Revolution is said it begins in 1763. That's 100 years later. The Navigation Acts did not actually cause the American Revolution. They were annoying to the colonists, but it was not enough to cause the American Revolution for a lot of reasons. One, fundamentally, the colonial economy, most people were just subsistence farmers. They're barely surviving. They don't buy any goods, they don't use money, and so this isn't going to affect them in the slightest bit. So for most colonists, these didn't matter at all. They did affect the country differently. The Navigation Acts were not really bad for the southern colonies. The southern colonies developed differently than the northern colonies' economies. South will be solidly agriculture, almost solidly agriculture, and they'll grow staple crops in large amounts. A lot of tobacco, especially later, a lot of cotton, which is why the South will have slavery, because that's the only part of the country you can grow those products. The North has a more advanced economy, so the New England colonies, they were in more economic competition with England. That's why the American Revolution starts in the North. That's why it starts in Massachusetts, because Massachusetts had one of the most advanced economies, and so it was in more economic competition with England. So, being good Americans, they started the great American tradition of breaking laws to make money. In Massachusetts, they broke laws all over the place during this period. The British tried to get them to stop several times. And again, read the notes on the old colonial system, but overall, Massachusetts they broke the law, the Navigation Acts all over the place. Now, during this entire 100-year period, though, both England and the colonists, they had some problems, but they were all low-key conflicts. So in every one of the colonies, there was some representative of the British Crown. In contrast, in every one of the colonies, there was some sort of colonial assembly. When we say colonial assembly, that's like a legislature that is representative of the population. So the colonial assemblies or the legislatures, all 13 of the colonies had one, and that was a government that was represented by that colony. And so, as you would expect, the colonists were always pushing for more independence from England, and England is constantly pushing for more control over the colonies. But these are all low-key conflict. There was problems. I'm not going to say there were no problems, but no one was talking about independence, and there wasn't bloodshed. There wasn't fighting over the issues. They were all low-key conflicts. And in that 100-year period, so we get these governments formed, and they never sat down officially and said who had which powers, but over that entire period, what's really important to know is England never once taxed the colonists in that entire period. England never once passed a tax in the colonies. England passed tariffs, but never a tax. So through that entire 100+ year period, the colonists had the power of the purse. They had the power to tax themselves. Did England ever say, colonists, you have the right to tax yourself? No. England never said that they had the right to do it. The colonists just did it. And so for more than 100 years, they established a precedent. Remember, precedents in American legal system become laws. They become rights, and then they become laws. So precedence is really important. The colonists will have 100 years of precedence, and after 100 years, colonists assumed they had the right to tax themselves. England never told them they did, but 100 years of precedence is obviously a very long time. Colonists were breaking the law during this period, and the British knew it too. But the British let the colonists get away with it because during this period, England became the world superpower, and a big reason for that was because of the colonies. So England's doing great economically, and the colonies are doing really well. A lot of colonists were able to do really well, and some of them become very wealthy. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, George Washington. Both sides are doing well. And so that's why it's called salutary neglect. England knew that laws were being broken and just let them get away with this. And so by the time you get to 1773, there are no colonists that are calling for independence. 1773, you don't get colonists calling for independence. If you asked anyone in America, what are you? They would say, I'm an Englishman, or I'm a Virginian, and they're the colony. But usually they'd call themselves an Englishman. They identified with England, and they wanted to stay part of England. The only reason this worked was because both sides had never sat down and said, all right, who has what power? They had never explicitly said who had what power. It had just been left vague. Specifically, the power to tax had always been with the colonists, but they never once defined it. And that is what will lead to the American Revolution, is the lack of definition. Here is something you can try. If you have a significant other, call them over and say, honey, please sit down, we need to talk. Sit down, look them in the eye, and ask them, who has the power in this relationship? I guarantee you, your relationship will last maybe 30 days, if you're lucky. Because after you try to define who has what power, or who has the power, that's when everything becomes a power struggle. And this sounds vague. I will give you specifics on exactly what I mean. The American Revolution is essentially a power struggle. Now, it doesn't mean that aren't real issues, but I'll explain what I mean specifically. I don't ask you to know many dates in this class, but one you absolutely must know is 1763. 1763 is always said to be the beginning of the American Revolution, and it is the beginning of the American Revolution, and the American Revolution will start because of a war. It's called the 7 Years' War, but the part that happened in North America is called the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War will specifically be in North America, and it is England versus France. During the French and Indian War, the colonists, they will be part of the war. Colonists will start will be responsible for helping start the fighting. This is where George Washington got all his military experience before the American Revolution, was in the French and Indian War. Colonists were part of the fighting. They wanted to participate. They supported the war, and they will benefit from it. Keep that in mind. And the French and Indian War is the beginning of it, because the British will win totally and completely. So here is a map of America before 1763. The French and Indian War, it ends with the Treaty of Paris, 1763. That is not to be confused with the Treaty of Paris, 1783. 20 years later, that ends the American Revolution. Treaty of Paris, 1763, that ends the French and Indian War. And take a look at this map. That is the map of North America before the Treaty of Paris. France is in blue, England's in red, Spain in green. And here's the map of North America afterwards. France is wiped off the map. England controls everything up to the Mississippi River, Spain, everything west of the Mississippi River. So England won just completely wiped France off the map. This is what started the American Revolution. How does winning a war completely start an American Revolution? Well, it did for several reasons. Make sure you read about them in your notes there. The British will end up doing several things that upset the colonists. One of them is they pass an invisible line called the Proclamation Line and say, do not go west of that colonists. And they had good reason to do this. Colonists were being attacked by Native Americans, and then Native Americans, and then the colonists would blame England for not protecting. Well, England does not have the manpower to protect all the colonists if they keep pushing west. So England will tell them, don't go west of the Appalachian Mountains approximately, and the colonists will be furious about this. George Washington had like 60,000 acres in Ohio. And so colonists were really upset about this. But the single most important reason, 1763 and the end of the French and Indian War, is the beginning of the American Revolution, is debt and taxes. Wars, and this, you absolutely need to know this, wars are insanely expensive. That has been true all throughout history. The most debt the United States has ever been in, the highest taxes have ever been, was World War II, followed by the Civil War, then World War I. Wars are the most expensive thing a government can do. England more than doubled its national debt because of the French and Indian War. And after the French and Indian War, the United States, England debt more than doubled. And so England will have to start raising taxes to pay down the debt from the war. And wars are very complicated, but one thing that is certain is taxes will be raised. And here's a fun fact for you. In every single war in US history, the United States government has raised taxes, except the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The highest taxes have ever been is during war. Wars are expensive. How is that possible? Did we figure out in the 21st century how to wage war without it costing money? No, it's because taxes have become a political issue rather than an economic issue or a budget issue. And but they basically all went on the credit card. So wars are insanely expensive. That is what starts the American Revolution, is a war that the British totally and completely won. The first thing England will try to do in order to pay down its debt, because the colonists were active participants in the war and they benefited from it, and colonists called themselves English citizens, Englishmen. Well, the British, they were taxing the hell out of the people in England. So that's one, sometimes it's portrayed as the British just are arbitrarily taxing the colonists, and nothing about the taxes were arbitrary. Every tax that England had in England, every tax that they tried in the colonies, they already had in England, and the people in England, they were being taxed. So the citizens of England were, and so England decided, well, shouldn't the colonists help pay for this? And that is why England, beginning in 1763, England is the one that starts changing the more than 100 years that had been working so well. The very first thing they do is called the Revenue or Sugar Act. Now, I told you the colonists always tax themselves, but the British could pass tariffs and duties. The Revenue and Sugar Act is different from every other, this is a duty, but it was different from every other duty or tariff the British had ever passed, because this is the first time the British tried to use the duty for revenue purposes, to raise money, not just to regulate trade. This is the first time the British passed a tariff, Revenue or Sugar Act, for the purpose of raising money, not regulate trade. And it was a tariff on sugar. You don't have to know this, but just so you understand a difference between tariffs and taxes also is if you're going to raise money with a tax, you raise the taxes. You raise how much is going to be taxed. For tariffs, if you want to earn money for the government or for revenue purposes, they actually work counterintuitively. You lower them. So let's say the British want to make money and they are charging for everything that comes into the colonies, like sugar. Well, the British have a $1 tariff on sugar, say. So just arbitrarily, sugar coming in is $2 a pound. The British have a tariff of $1, which means the colonists have to pay $3. Well, if the British lowers that, instead of $1, it's 50 cents. So now the $2 sugar is $2.50. Colonists are more likely to pay that. And then when they pay that 50 cents, that's revenue for the government. You don't have to memorize how tariffs work. But that's a difference between tax and tariff. Also, if you're wondering why I talk about tariffs so much, it's not that I talk about tariffs. It's that Americans up until 1913 talk about tariffs all the time, because tariffs are the #1 source of revenue for the federal government until 1913, when the progressive income taxes passed. That's why up until 1913, you hear about the tariff all the time, because it is what is considered the main source. It is the main source of revenue for the government, and Americans hate taxes so much. So it comes up over and over again. That's why I'm explaining it now. So the Revenue Sugar Act is a tariff on sugar specifically for the purpose of making money. Colonists, when the British passed this, colonists, they didn't like it, but they accepted it because England had always had the power to pass tariffs. And so it bothered colonists, but they didn't say too much about it. One you have to know, the most important event leading up to this, the Stamp Act. The year after the Sugar Act, the British passed the Stamp Act, and it's really important. You must know it. The Stamp Act is the first direct internal tax the British ever put on the colonists. It's the first time the British ever taxed the colonists. And it's a tax because it affects everyone. It said that you had to have a special stamp from a British official on any paper product. So a deed, a will, newspapers, playing cards, everything. When the British passed the Stamp Act, it's the first tax, they already had a Stamp Act in England, and the rates in England were even higher than in the colonies. So this was not something that the British were just arbitrarily doing to oppress the colonies. They already have one in England with higher rates than the ones in the colonies. And yet the colonists went absolutely nuts. Colonists went crazy. They boycotted British goods. They had riots, especially in Massachusetts. Massachusetts is the epicenter of crazy leading up to the Civil War, American Revolution. It's what South Carolina will be leading up to the Civil War. But Massachusetts has the craziest people and does the craziest things. And so colonists went nuts. They even called together, it's called the Stamp Act Congress, where all the colonies sent representatives, and they gave that famous line, "We will give all due subordination to Parliament, but we do not accept taxation without representation," shortened to no taxation without representation. So the colonists were saying, colonies do not have a seat in Parliament, and so since we don't have a seat in Parliament, you cannot tax us. What are the British supposed to do here? The boycott was effective, and it really hurt British companies, so the British have two options here. One, they can send in their military and just squash the colonists and force them to pay this. But that costs money. With how big America is, to send soldiers all through the colonies to enforce this, that would cost a ton of money, and the British are already in debt. So that's not a realistic option. So the British ended up repealing the Stamp Act. Before any colonists could pay anything, colonists made such a stink about it that the British repealed the Stamp Act before any colonists even had time to pay pay anything for it. So the British repealed it. But when they repealed it, they also passed the Declaratory Act in 1766, which said, we govern you in all cases whatsoever. So what the British are saying here is, all right, we're repealing this, but we are allowed to tax you. Colonists are saying, you can't tax us because we don't have representation in Parliament. And this is where everything changes. So obviously the colonists, they won the battle. But after this, nothing makes sense. Everything after this is just a power struggle. This is the only direct tax the British will pass that affects all the colonies. This is the only one that the British ever passed that affects all the colonies, and no colonists ever paid anything for it. So can this be the cause of the American Revolution? Can taxes specifically? No, because no colonists ever paid anything. What starts the American Revolution is after this, they have sat down and they have said who has the power, and at the end of it, both sides say, we have the power. After this, everything stops making sense unless you understand it as a power struggle, because both sides have made it very clear they don't agree who has the power to tax. The very next year, a series of acts were passed called the Townshend Duties. Now, the Townshend Duties, that is duties or tariffs on several products like glass, tea, lead, paints, paper, all sorts of things the colonists need. It is tariffs on all those things for the purpose of raising revenue, not to regulate trade. Just like the Sugar Act. So this is effectively like the Sugar Act. Townshend duties are effectively like the Sugar Act. The only difference is they're on more products, but the colonists had always accepted the British right to pass tariffs. They even accepted the Sugar Act, so the British figured, fine, we'll just pass tariffs for revenue purpose and we'll pass it on all these products. Because the colonists accepted the Sugar Act, so they must accept these, right? No, they went nuts. Colonists went absolutely crazy. They started boycotting all products being sent over from England. They went absolutely nuts. So why would the colonists go crazy about the Townshend duties if they had accepted the Sugar Act? And it's because of what happened in between. After the Stamp Act, colonists were hypersensitive to anything the British did. So when they passed these, colonists just went off the handles. And the British stayed with this Townshend duties for 3 years. They stayed with it for 3 years until finally in 1770, the boycotts were so effective, the British said, all right, fine, we are going to get rid of the Townshend duties. And they repealed all of them, except one, tea. Why tea? Was totally arbitrary. The British specifically left a duty. They said they had to leave one of the tariffs in place so they could demonstrate to the colonists that England had the authority to do this. It was just arbitrarily picking one of the products, and they specifically did it so they could show to the colonists, we have the authority to do this. Another way of saying, we have the power to do this. We have the right to do this. So England arbitrarily keeps it on one product, tea, just to show the colonists we're the ones with the power. You know where this is going. Christopher Nolan couldn't write a plot this good. After it was repealed in 1770, both sides were just so dug in. It was obvious there was going to be a problem. And there was, in 1770, called the Boston Massacre, some British soldiers killed some Bostonians because the British were horrible and brutal. Oh, and also, the colonists were throwing snowballs at first, and then snowballs with rocks in them, then just rocks, and then bricks, and a brick hit a soldier's face and messed him up bad. So it was portrayed as the colonists were just hapless victims. They weren't. They were the ones that had started the whole thing by throwing rocks and bricks at soldiers. Some soldiers really hurt too. You can read about that in your notes. England handled this very well. England realized this is bad. So England is the one that actually pulled back. They pulled all their troops out of Boston. They allowed those soldiers to be tried. Side note, British soldiers being tried in a Boston court by a Boston jury and a Boston judge, they should have been killed. But luckily their lawyer was a guy named John Adams. It's one of John Adams' greatest moments. England handled this very well, and for 3 years there was relative calm. Till 1773, it all came crashing down with the Tea Act. And this is so important, you must know it. You will hear people say over and over again, the Tea Act was a tax on tea, and it was not. It was not a tax in any way, shape, or form, except that it affected a tariff. But let me explain what it did. And do not ever say the Tea Act was a tax on tea. The Tea Act is a bailout of a British company. It's called the British East India Trading Company. The British East India Trading Company was a huge company that had a lot of political power because it had a lot of money. And so it had been very mismanaged. And so it was doing bad financially. So it was big and powerful. And so it asked Parliament to help it. The Tea Act said the British East India Trading Company could sell tea into the colonies without paying a tariff or a duty. Great. What does that mean for the colonists? It means the British East India Trading Company, which is the largest seller of tea into the colonies, can now sell without paying that tariff. It means tea is going to be cheaper for the colonists. So colonists will have to pay less for the tea. The British East India Trading Company, the biggest seller of tea into the colonies, is going to be able to sell more tea. So everyone wins, right? There's no losers in this. Colonists get cheaper tea. What's the problem? Well, the colonists went nuts. That's all the Tea Act did, though. It did just a bailout for one company, and it was going to make tea cheaper for the colonists, but the colonists went crazy. Why would the colonists be upset for cheaper tea? Because as a power move. The colonists said that one, they're giving a monopoly to the British East India Trading Company. It's not technically a monopoly since colonists can still buy tea from anyone. But more importantly, the colonists actually said stuff like, you're trying to make us drink our principles with our tea, whatever the hell that means. So the colonists are upset that they're going to be paying less for tea because out of principle, because that one Townsend duty was left on that one product, tea. So when the British East India Trading Company's tea got to the colonies would not let it unload off the boats. So all throughout the colonies, the tea just sat there, especially in Boston, especially wouldn't let the tea unload there. So there's these boats full of tea, and I can't stress this enough. That stuff was insanely expensive. Like one of the cartons of tea was worth more than like average colonists would see in 5 years or something. It just insane amounts of money. And as you know, as the tea sat there in the harbor, one day, December 16th, several colonists dressed up like Native Americans got really drunk, got on the boats and started throwing the tea overboard. Why did they dress up like Native Americans? So when the British officials came and started questioning people, all the rest of the colonists could say, just some Native Americans. Plausible deniability. That was a fortune. The amount of tea that they destroyed, when I say it's a fortune, it was a fortune. When the colonists did this, that was the last straw for the British. The British were so sick of the colonists acting and behaving like this, especially the people of Boston, that they responded to the Boston Tea Party with a series of acts called the coercive acts. The British called it the coercive acts. The colonists called it the intolerable acts. Now, of the four of them, so, you definitely don't have to know. Boston Port Act closed the port of Boston until the city of Boston paid all the tea back. And Boston is a port city, so most of its revenue was from trade at the port. So this hurt the city of Boston. That wasn't bad for the colonists, because a lot of the other colonies, especially in the South, they didn't like Boston and Massachusetts. They thought the people of Boston were out of their minds and a bunch of just asking for trouble, which they really were. The people of Boston, they were, a lot of stuff they did was just very irrational. And so the other colonies, they would have been fine with the shutting down of the Boston port. Of the four of these acts, the one that led all the colonies to rally behind the people of Boston, the state of Massachusetts, was a Massachusetts Government Act. Because the Massachusetts Government Act took away representative government from the people of Massachusetts. The Massachusetts Government Act said all government officials will, from now on, be appointed in Massachusetts. And the reason that is so important is because what do the people of South Carolina care about the people of Massachusetts losing representative government? Remember that Massachusetts had representative government from the very beginning of its existence. That means the people of Massachusetts are losing their say in the government completely. The reason that one brought all the colonies to Massachusetts' defense is because if England thought it could take away representative government in Massachusetts, that means England thinks it can take away representative government in all the colonies. It has that right, it has that power. That is what led all the colonies to rally behind Massachusetts. And when they rallied behind Massachusetts, they will form the First Continental Congress, where they will send a letter to England saying, please stop doing this. Please go back to the way things were in 1763. And that's why that date is so important. They will say, please go back to the way things were in 1763. And when it got to England, King George, he wouldn't even look at it. He said the New England governments are in a state of rebellion, blows must decide, and that blow would come at a place called Lexington. Lexington and Concord in 1775 are the beginning shots of the American Revolution and the beginning shots of the age of revolutions. This will spark a revolutionary movement that will go all over the globe, in Central America, South America, Mexico, other Central South American countries, and eventually to France and Greece. Once the war started, the colonies established the Second Continental Congress, which will be the unofficial government, which will effectively be the government of the colonies for the first part of the American Revolution. That is also where they elect George Washington to be commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, send diplomats overseas, especially to France, to try to get assistance. And they will also issue the olive branch petition, where they will say, please go back to the way things were in 1763. The reason I mention that, the First and Second Continental Congresses, the colonists will say, please go back to the way things were in 1763, because they did not want independence. They did not want to start a revolution. Most colonists would have been happy being part of the British Empire. So, who started the American Revolution? Was it the colonists or what is it, the British? There have been historians that have spent their life saying it was the British. There have been historians that spent their life saying it was the colonists. And you have two potential essay questions, one saying the British were responsible, one saying the colonists were responsible. Because there's something called cognitive dissonance. It's the ability to hold two competing ideas in your head and recognize they both have some validity. So you can easily make the case that it was the British that started it. They're the ones that changed the old colonial system. They're the ones that changed a good working relationship. but you could also easily say it's the colonists. They wanted to be part of the British Empire. They wanted to be British subjects, but they wanted to be treated differently than all the other British subjects. They were the freest colonists in the entire world. And some of their specific actions just cannot be defended. The Boston Tea Party cannot be defended. So it's up in the air. Now, what was the cause of the American Revolution? Was it taxes? No, because only one tax was ever passed in the colonists, a direct internal tax, and that was the Stamp Act, and that was repealed before the colonists ever have to pay anything for it. For their part, the British could have stopped this from happening. The colonists did not want to be independent, but the British, they're the world superpower. How many world superpowers care about their colonies? Does Puerto Rico ever tell the United States government what to do? Of course not. So colonies, they do not listen. England acted exactly the way you'd expect the world superpower to act. They were arrogant. And they could have stopped this. And the thing is, it would have been in England's best interest to not lose the colonies. What were the colonial motives? It was all over the place. George Washington was unhappy. He wouldn't have his land out west. There were Southerners that were worried. England had gotten rid of slavery and the South's economy depended on slavery. So there were some people that worried about that. John Hancock, the guy with the large signature, his job was a smuggler, breaking British law. So he benefited from this. None of those explain it. There's been a lot of things that this is the cause, and none of those explain what caused the American Revolution. What they all represent, they all contributed to it, but what they all represent was the issue of self-government. The colonies, especially Virginia and Massachusetts, from the very beginning, pretty early on, they had representative government. Representative government had existed in America since almost the very beginning. The British had challenged representative democracy. Colonists thought it was their power to tax. The British said it was their power to tax. And so they were taking away political power from the colonies. And that is what caused the American Revolution. It's not taxes specifically, it's the power to tax or the power to govern. There was a regular Minuteman from Massachusetts named Levi Preston who said it better than anyone else. He said it so simply. What we meant in going for those redcoats was this: we always had governed ourselves and we always meant to. They didn't mean we should. The power to govern is so fundamentally important. The power of representative government is so fundamentally important in this country. That's what started the American Revolution. One last thing, revolutions, the Russian Revolution, the Mexican Revolution, French Revolution, you go all throughout the world in revolutions, they follow the same format. The poor and downtrodden rise up, overthrow the rich, overthrow the government, and establish a new government because they don't like being poor. They don't like being treated bad. The American Revolution is different. It's different for two reasons. First, who led the American Revolution? The wealthiest and most important people in America. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin, all of the richest and wealthiest people. So that's one reason the American Revolution is different. The richest and most powerful people in the colonies. Second, what is their objective? A revolution, by its very definition, a violent upheaval of the status quo. Are they fighting for change? No. They're fighting to keep things the same. And they said that explicitly. Bring things back to the way things were in 1763. So they're not fighting for changing the system. They're fighting for keeping the system exactly the same. England is the one that changed the system. It's a backward-looking revolution. That's why the American Revolution, it is the only conservative revolution that I know of in the world. And it represents the United States. The United States fundamentally is a very conservative country. Change comes incredibly slow. Winston Churchill said it best. Americans will always do what's right once they've exhausted every other option. Hope everyone's doing well.